All right. So it looks like we're recording. So welcome everyone to our special Chroma Talk. We're calling this a Chroma Talk. It's kind of like a TED Talk, but done through our church. And so we all know each other here, but just for the sake of anyone who might be watching on video later, my name is Isaac Sir. I'm the lead pastor of Chroma Church, and I'll be leading us through this session today. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to have a short presentation. When I say short, I'll try to keep it less than 30 minutes. And that'll be followed by Q&A. And so please, think of questions that you might want to ask, but you don't need to wait until the Q&A to ask your question. You can ask your question anytime. So go ahead and write it in the chat, or even if you want to turn your mic on and just kind of jump in between slides, that'll be fine too. So periodically, I'll pause and ask if anyone has any questions. So I want to start by, first of all, saying that we recognize that there is a wide range of views when it comes to Genesis chapter 1 and when it comes to creation. There's a wide range of views. And I have respect for all of those views because they all have a certain noble purpose and they all have a good heart behind them. So this presentation is not to say that the view that I'm about to present is the only view. That's not my purpose. The view that we're going to learn about today is one possible view among many. But I do feel that this view has many strengths over the other views, which is why I'm presenting it here today. So if everyone's ready to begin, I will share my screen and we will get into the presentation. So we're calling this an alternative view of Genesis 1. I'm calling it alternative because it has been around for a while, but it is not the most popular view. And so probably most of you have not been familiarized with this before. So hopefully this will be a good introduction to that. So out of all the views, I would say that the two most popular views are the traditional literal interpretation and also the day-age interpretation. So the traditional literal interpretation, and both of these interpretations, they've been around, but the problem is that both of them are flawed in a way because they both have significant weaknesses that need to be addressed. And that's true of every view. Even the view that I'm about to present today, it's not perfect. There is no perfect view. And so that's not really a criticism, but it's a reality. Right, that these two views have certain weaknesses that need to be addressed and questions that they have difficulty answering. So with the traditional literal interpretation, that has been the most popular view for most of church history. So for at least the past 2,000 years, maybe even longer, that has been the most accepted view. And so that's the view that God created the world in 6 literal days, 6 24-hour periods. And what I like about the view is how it really tries to uphold Scripture as the truth. It takes Scripture at face value, and it really recognizes the authority of Scripture. So that's what I appreciate about the view, and I honor that. Of course, what is the problem with the traditional view? The weakness is that out of all the 8 or 9 views that are out there, the traditional view creates the most conflict with modern science, unfortunately. And, if that's something that you can live with, then that's fine. That's a personal choice. And there are a lot of people who believe in the traditional view because they really don't see any need to pay attention to the scientific evidence. But if you're a type of person that you want to believe in the scientific evidence, then this can create a conflict. One of the biggest problems with the traditional view is it has a very hard time explaining the apparent age of the universe. So what I mean by the apparent age is when scientists look at the universe, when they look at the world, it has the appearance of being very old. Every test that they run shows that the Earth is billions of years old. You know, when they look at the rocks and things like that, it looks very, very old, and not just evidence on the Earth, but even in space. So when you look outside at the stars and you look at the age of the starlight, you know, that starlight has been traveling for billions of years. That's what it looks like. And so the traditional view has a hard time explaining that. Um, just a couple of verses to think about. So Numbers chapter 23, verse 19, it says that God is not a man that he should lie. So God doesn't lie. And then Psalm 19, verse 1 says that the heavens declare the glory of God. So if we look up at the heavens and the heavens tell us that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, but then, you know, the Bible seems to say that everything was created in 6 days. Well, it almost makes God out to be a deceiver. It seems a little deceptive. So that's definitely a weakness with the traditional view. With the day age interpretation, that other one on the bottom you see there, that's the interpretation where one day is not a 24-hour period, but it's actually an age. It's an era. That could be millions of years or even billions of years long. And so that has become a very popular view. And they came up with this view, scholars and theologians, they came up with this view because they wanted to create a way to have the Bible agree with science. So this is a way to kind of get them reconciled and to make them compatible with each other. But the biggest problem with the day age interpretation is that the order that things are created in Genesis 1, that order doesn't match with what science says. So, for example, in Genesis 1, light was created before the sun, or plants were created before animals, and birds were created before reptiles. So the order doesn't agree with what the scientific order is. And so that kind of defeats the purpose of this whole interpretation, right? Like this interpretation was meant to try to reconcile scripture with science. But if the order of things in Genesis 1 doesn't match with what scientists say, then it's kind of self-defeating. So which do we choose? Which do we choose? That's the question, right? Because these are the two most popular views. Well, what if there was a view that allows for either a young or old Earth? So what if there's a view that says that, yeah, if you believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old, that's fine. Or if you believe that the Earth is 13.8 billion years old, that's fine too. And what if there was a view that upholds the truth and the authority of Scripture? It takes Scripture literally. And finally, a view that doesn't create any conflict with scientific evidence. If there was a view like this, wouldn't you want to know more about it? I know I certainly would. And that's the view that I'm presenting today. And that view is called historic creationism. Historic creationism. And you can look it up. There's a lot of information on it on Google. So just a couple of things to note about historic creationism before I move on. This view was largely developed by a professor named John Sailhamer. He was an Old Testament professor in San Francisco, and he passed away recently. And it's important for me to state that this is not a new view. So I was very careful not to say that this is a new view. This is an alternative view because it's not very popular, but it's actually been around for a long time, even since ancient times. some of the ancient Jewish scholars had a similar view like this. So it's not a new view. If there's any view that's truly new, that's not a good thing, right? If there's any view that's totally new, that's not a trustworthy view, because that means that the whole church didn't know about it and the whole church was wrong for 2,000 years until this new view came along. And so you don't want to, trust a new view. So this has been around for a long time. And I do want to say that it is gaining popularity very quickly. So as more and more pastors and theologians learn about this view, the more people are adopting it and seeing that it really has a lot of strengths. So even John Piper and Matt Chandler, two very big pastors, they adopt this view. And they're definitely conservative evangelicals. So there's nothing heretical about this view at all. All right, so I'm going to jump into what the view actually says, but are there any questions at this point before I move on? Okay, so why don't we look at what the view actually says? So what historical creationism says is that everything was created in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Everything was created. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So according to this view, everything was created. So the stars, the sun, the moon, the skies, the mountains, the oceans, the land, even the vegetation and animals. Everything was created in verse 1, except for human beings. Except for human beings. Okay? So that's what the first part of the view says. And then from Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 onward, the rest of the chapter is actually about the preparation of the Garden of Eden. So yeah, that is a very big shift from the other views, especially the traditional view. But basically what historical creationism says is that most of Genesis chapter 1 is not about the creation of the world, but it's about the preparation of the Garden of Eden. So everything that we're reading about day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, that's all happening in the Garden of Eden. Another thing that it says is that Eden equals the promised land, which is Israel. And again, that's kind of a new and maybe a different viewpoint. There have been a lot of theories about where Eden was, and some people say that Eden was in, modern day Iraq or Turkey, or Eden was somewhere in Africa. Well, according to this view, Eden was in Canaan. It was in Israel. That's where Eden was. And so what we're reading about in Genesis chapter 1 is the preparation of the promised land for God's people. And that's a very important theme in this view. So what are some of the key features of historical creationism? Well, first of all, according to this view and this reading of Genesis chapter 1, the word day is interpreted as a 24-hour period. It is a 24-hour period. So if reading the word day as a 24-hour period is important to you, then this view allows you to do that. You can read it and you can still maintain a 24-hour day when you read Genesis chapter 1. So that's one feature. Another feature is that the world/earth is not talking about the entire planet Earth, but it's talking about the land, as in the promised land. So it's talking about like a much more narrow area, geographical area. The next feature is that the word good has a very specific meaning. So according to historical creationism, good doesn't mean beautiful, it doesn't mean excellent, it doesn't mean the opposite of evil, but what it means is it's good for humankind. It's beneficial for people, or the people of God. That's what the word good means. And I'll talk more about that later. And finally, the real purpose behind historical creationism, it's not to reconcile scripture with science. That's not the main purpose. The main purpose of historical creationism is to foreshadow and highlight the importance of the promised land in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament talks about the promised land a lot. You know, the promised land is a very key focal point in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, and all throughout. And so basically, historical creationism is saying that Genesis 1 introduces the concept of the promised land from the very beginning. And so it creates this foreshadowing effect and strengthens the unity of the overall Old Testament story. That's really the focal point here. Okay, so those are the key features. And so now that we've gone through the key features, let me go through a couple of the details according to the passage. And here you can really see how historical creationism has a lot of strengths and a lot of advantages over some of the other views. So let me talk about day one. All right, so day one. So remember, everything, the whole world was created in Genesis 1, chapter 1. So the earth already exists, right? So just have that assumption. The earth already exists. And so starting in day one, the focus is on this area that's supposed to be the Garden of Eden. And this all happens between verses 2 and 5. All right, so in this day, it says that the earth was formless and empty. That's how most translations have it. But the way that historical creationism interprets that, instead of the earth was formless and empty, the earth is translated as land. It's the same word in Hebrew. Hebrew, the word is eretz, and eretz can be translated as earth or world or land. So instead of the earth was formless and empty, the land was uninhabited and it was a wilderness. Okay, so it's this uninhabited wilderness. That's what the translation is. And then this word darkness, it says that there was darkness covering the earth. And so that darkness really refers to cloud covering, that there's dense dark clouds and dense fog that's covering the land. So it blocks out all the light, right? So the sun already exists at this point because the sun was created in verse 1. But there's no light in the land because of these dark clouds. So when God says, let there be light, it doesn't mean the creation of light for the first time. Basically, it's talking about the removal of the clouds. So God removes the layer of dark clouds, which allows the sunlight to penetrate and to appear on the land for I don't know if it's the first time, but at least in this period. And then God says it was good. And this word good is really important. What does he mean by good? Again, he means it's good for people. It's good for human habitation and human flourishing, because we need light, right? People need light in order to live and survive and function. So in that sense, light is good. And here is a really cool detail. Many people don't know this. Most people don't know this, but in Genesis 1, the first day is not called the first day in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's actually one day, not the first day. But all the other days are called the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day. Only day one is different. Day one is called one day. And all the other views have really no way to explain that. There's no explanation for why day one is called one day and all the other days use the ordinal numbers. But historical creationism has a good explanation for that. It's because this is not the first day of the world, right? The world has already existed for however long you believe. The world has already existed, but this was one day in this area, in this land. It was one day that God, removed the clouds and brought the light. So after this one day, then everything is counted as the second day, the third day, the fourth day. So that's a very interesting and I think a good explanation for why day one is treated a little bit differently. Okay, so that's day one. And let's move on to day two. So in day two, this is from Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 to 8. A couple of interesting features here. So in most translations says, let there be an expanse between the waters. And I don't know what you imagined in your mind. It sounds like there was water in the sky and water in the ground, and God kind of separated the two waters, but it was confusing. It's always been confusing for me too. Like, I didn't understand how the water in the sky could be up there, what form it took. But according to this view, it's the removal of the dense fog. So remember, this whole land was covered in dark clouds and it was covered in fog. But the fog, we know that the fog is water vapor. It's made out of water vapor. And so God removes the fog, which creates this clear space between the ground and the sky for the first time. All right, so when the fog is removed, now you can see this space, this open space between the sky and the ground, and that's the expanse between the waters. And again, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but not every day is called good. God doesn't say it was good after every day. In fact, in day two, God doesn't say it was good. And that's very curious. Why doesn't God say that in day two, but he says it in all the other days? It's because of what the word good means. Remember, the word good means good for humankind, good for human habitation or human flourishing. So he doesn't say good here because there's nothing been created, nothing was developed that actually helps human habitations. At this point, the land is still covered in water. The ground is still completely covered in water. And just because you remove the fog, that doesn't make the land any more habitable. So because it's still not good for human habitation, God says, or he does not say, that day two is good. Again, the other views, like the traditional view or the day age view, they have a very hard time explaining this, but historic creationism has a good explanation. We're not looking at every day, so we're just going to look at two more days, day 3 and day 4. So day 3, excuse me, day 3, this is verses 9 to 13. So in this day, dry land appears and vegetation appear. So dry land appears for the first time, vegetation appears for the first time, and they are called good. Why? Because they're good for human habitation. They're good for people. So, you can start to see a theme here. And yeah, this theme goes all the way through Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And finally, day 4. Here, in verse 14, it says, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for seasons and for days and years. Now, again, I'm sure a lot of people have been confused by day 14 because God created light in day 1. So if God created light in day 1, how could he create lights in the sky on day 4? It sounds like light existed before the sun, which we know is not really possible because all the light we have comes from the sun. How could there be light without the sun? So what historic creationism is saying is that this is not the best translation. In fact, the way that historic creationism would translate it, if you can look at the screen, it says, let the light in the expanse be for separating the day and the night and serving as signs. So it's a slightly different translation, but it's a totally valid translation. Totally valid. It is grammatically reasonable to read it this way. And so verse 14 is not talking about the creation of the sun and the moon, but it's talking about their purpose. It's their purpose. Let the lights serve the purpose of distinguishing day and night and serving as signs for seasons and days and years. That's what their purpose is. So, so day 4 makes more sense, again, in the historic creationist view. So the other days, day 5 and 6, are a little bit more straightforward. So I don't have any slides or any notes about that. That you can just read, just the same as all the other views. So yes, I forgot to show this point. Right? So day 4 is talking about the purpose of the sun and the moon and the stars. So I just want to wrap it up then. How does this view bless me? You might be wondering right now, this is interesting or semi-interesting, but I really want to know, what does this have to do with me? How does historic creationism bless or encourage me? Well, I think there are 3 ways. And the first way is that it removes any conflict between science and scripture. Again, for some people, this is not an issue, right? For some people, they have no problem ignoring the science and just saying, I just believe the Bible, and whatever the Bible tells me is good enough for me. And that's fine. That's totally fine. But for those who do struggle because they see a conflict between science and scripture, then historical creationism can be a blessing because it removes that conflict, right? Because remember, according to this view, everything was created in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, but it doesn't say how long. It doesn't say how long it took. So if you want to believe that it took only 1 week, you can believe that. But if you want to believe that it took billions of years, you can believe that too. And so, I think that this is very important for some people. In fact, I just listened to an interview by the comedian Ricky Gervais. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a very popular comedian. And in this interview, he was saying how one of the main reasons he is an atheist is because he sees so much conflict between the Bible and science. And he just can't deal with that. So he chose to reject God. And that's really sad, right? Because I don't think that was necessary. The second way that this blesses us is it demonstrates the wisdom, the power, and the faithfulness of God in planning for his covenant with Israel from the very beginning. So really, the focus of historical creationism is to show how God planned from the very beginning to prepare the promised land for his people. And, we think that he started to talk about this only in the middle of Genesis. But actually, what this view says is God started talking and planning for this from the beginning of Genesis, even Genesis chapter 1. So God is just amazing in his wisdom. He planned for Canaan, he planned for Israel even before the creation of the Garden of Eden. And that means he already had good plans for Israel. He had good plans for his people from before time. And that's a wonderful thing to see about God. And that leads to the third blessing is we can trust God more. So if God had all these wonderful plans for Israel, even before everything was created, then that means God has wonderful plans for us too, right? He's the same God. He is the same God of wisdom and power and faithfulness. So we can trust that God has wonderful plans for us even before we were born. That's one of the things that we see through the historical creationist view. All right, so that's almost the end of my presentation. I have one more slide left. This is the last one. And so this is just a possible combined view of Genesis with what science teaches us. Okay, this is just a possible combined view. This is my own interpretation. Take it or leave it. It's really it's something I'm still working on. But anyway, so in this combined view, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, if you look at the row on the top, in that one verse, everything was created. The whole universe was created. And that verse contains 13.8 billion years. Okay? So that means all the planets and the stars, slowly formed, and the earth cooled, and God supernaturally brought the first life on earth, and he allowed that life to evolve. Okay, so God is guiding that evolution. He's the one who supernaturally brought the first life on earth. So that all happens in Genesis 1, verse 1. And then in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 and onward, it's the preparation of the Garden of Eden, just like we learned through this presentation, right? So the promised land in Israel. And at the end of Genesis 1, of course, he creates humankind. Then Genesis chapter 2, what we read there is it's a close-up of the creation of humankind. It's a close-up of the special creation. So I do believe that human beings were created especially by God out of the dust. And that's what we read in Genesis chapter 2. So, so I don't think we have to, accept that human beings evolved from primates. I don't think that's something we have to accept, because Genesis chapter 2 shows us that Adam and Eve were, created especially by God. And the last thing is Genesis chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. This is when Cain murdered his brother Abel. And God tells Cain that he has to wander the earth. And he puts a mark on Cain to warn other people not to harm him. And I don't know if you've ever wondered who these other people are. Like, how could there be other people in Genesis chapter 4 when we never read about who these other people are? So I think there are two possible answers. One is that these other people could be other children of Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve could have had many, many other children who multiplied, and they could be the other people. Or these other people could actually be proto-human societies, because everything else, all the other animal species, they evolved naturally through natural selection, and that includes some of the early proto-human species like Neanderthal, or Cro-Magnon people, and so forth. So they're not human in the sense that they're not especially created by God in the Garden of Eden. Only only Homo sapiens are created in that way. So it could be those other human societies, proto-human societies, that Cain was afraid of wandering into. So that's just a possible way of combining what science says with historical creationism. But that is pretty much the end of the presentation. So at this point, if anyone has any questions, I'd love to take those questions from you. Any questions at all? Go ahead and you can just type it into the chat, or you can turn your mic on and you can ask it verbally. So any questions here? Was there anything that wasn't completely clear? Maybe you want some clarification on it at all?
So I think the ideas that you were talking about are very interesting, especially because it's true some of the language is confusing about, separating the water from the water and things like that. One question I had was about the use of the definition of the word good.
Mm-hmm.
So, where did that idea come from that rather than just meaning good as opposed to bad, that it would specifically apply to being good for a human? Is that just like a theory, or is there, I mean, I guess I'm just wondering where that
Yeah,
idea might have come from.
it comes from the thematic focal point of the interpretation. So historical creationism, they didn't come up with it because they wanted to reconcile scripture with science, but they wanted to really emphasize God's relationship with his people. And so it's a way of highlighting the covenant that God has with Israel, right? And the land becomes so important. The promised land becomes so important, and the people become so important. So yeah, it comes from just that, the centrality of the people, right? They're why God is creating the Garden of Eden for the people. And so in that sense, the word good is also tied to that central focus. But I think you can also say that it doesn't make sense for good to mean anything else, because the word good can be like the opposite of evil, right? There's good and evil,
Mhm.
but it's not the opposite of evil. It's not morally good, right? Like water and land and vegetation, these are not morally good. So they must be good in some other sense. So you could say that they're good in the sense of excellence,
Mhm.
but that's also kind of odd, right? To say that land is excellent or vegetation is excellent. That's also odd. So out of all the different ways of interpreting good, I think it actually makes the most sense, right? To take it the way historical creationism takes it, which means it's most useful and beneficial for the people. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it was a really good question.
I have a question about proto-human types.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So if that, so you're saying like the Neanderthals and the proto-human types would eventually intermingle with the descendants of Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
And would it be dangerous to, I don't know, think that because the proto-human types, were they created in the image of God?
So according to that last slide, that last slide was just my attempt to try to match historical creationism with what science says. It's just my attempt. And so what I think is that no, they were not created in the image of God. They evolved, through millions of years. And, even though outwardly they look very similar to humans, I really see them more as very intelligent animals. So, even when you look at the science, like they had some knowledge of tools and they had some rituals and things like that, but that doesn't mean that they're spiritual people. And it doesn't mean that they have the breath of God or the spirit of God in them. So I see them more as very intelligent animals, but I think human beings, Homo sapien, we are a special creation of God, and God created us in his image and he breathed his spirit into us. And we see that in Genesis 2. So so yeah, I think that there was a short period where they actually intermingled, and that has been proven scientifically, because this is kind of shocking, but something like 10% of all European people have Neanderthal DNA in them. So so that's kind of weird, and that's kind of shocking, and I don't have all the answers there, but there's evidence clearly that human beings and Neanderthals intermingled. And yeah.
So how would you answer that question when someone with the Neanderthal DNA says, like, are you saying that my ancestors were not made in the image of God?
You know,
Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, but it's,
I mean, you know, ancestors can go so far back. You know, it's almost like, the way I see it is, in the Old Testament, for much of the Old Testament, right, God actually told Israel not to marry with the pagan nations around them, right? So that was the law of Moses. Moses said, if you are an Israelite, you shall only marry other Israelites. That was God's will. But we know that many of the Israelites broke that will, and they went ahead and they married and they had kids with pagan people around them, and that was never part of the plan. And I kind of see it a little bit like that, right? That they shouldn't have intermingled with, you know, these other people that are not made in the image of God, but they did. And you know, that was probably not God's will, but it happened, and that's kind of how I take it. But it's strange, you know. It definitely is strange. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do know that there's a fairly large percentage of people today that have Neanderthal DNA in them, and that's just a very weird thing. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that. Yeah. Thank you for the question, though. Anyone else? Okay. I have one final question. It's just kind of like a poll. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there are actually about 6 or 7 major interpretations of Genesis 1. And so, you know, we talked today about historical creationism. I mentioned the traditional view, the literal view, and then there's the day age interpretation, but there's actually 3 more. So would anyone here be interested in a more in-depth lecture on these other views? If anyone's interested, you know, I can organize another Zoom session like this, and I can kind of go through the 6 different views in a little bit more detail. And since we already talked about historical creationism, I probably don't need to spend too much time on that one, so I can focus more on the other 5. Okay. Okay, so I do see a couple of people saying yes. So maybe we'll organize a time, maybe next week or the week after, right, where we can go into those other views in a little bit more detail, and just to see the strengths and weaknesses. Again, you know, we're not here to say that one view is correct. You know, we respect everyone's choice to believe in the view that makes the most sense to you. So, okay. Well, thank you for, you know, being a part of this talk, and we'll post this video up on social media and YouTube so that other people can see it as a resource. And yeah, if you have any other questions about this at any time, please don't hesitate to ask. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now. Thanks, everyone.